Hey, Walter, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Good.
Listen, I need, before we do anything, for us to tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Walter Turner? And what are the things that you are the most involved in these days?
As usual, too many things. I think probably, first of all, I'm a longtime friend of Kumbature. We've known each other for more than a couple of decades and worked together in different places in the world. Most recently, we spent some time in Cuba, but we've been together, I believe, in Kenya. We've been together in New York. We've been together on the West Coast. At this moment, I'm heading up a number of different organizations. One of them is Global Exchange,
Yes.
which you actually were an intern, I believe, with Global Exchange.
Wow, that's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago. Probably best to classify Global Exchange as a international human rights network.
Yes.
We've worked a lot in Cuba, we've worked a lot in South Africa, we've worked a lot in the Middle East. Basically, we deal with issues of environment, with issues of human rights. Our most recent project, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is dealing with the black populations of Mexico and of Brazil and of Central America and of the Caribbean. And many people don't know that so many people from the African continent found themselves in Brazil and Cuba and Haiti and Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
So that's one of the projects.
Global Exchange is the first organization I interned in when I came in California. I believe it was 1997. It's been a while. And
it may have been earlier, but it was close. It was in the 90s.
90s. And really seeing the work around the reality tools, going to places, getting people to understand the political situation in the countries was something, amazing, unheard of at that time. Taking people from the U.S. not only to Cuba, but to Nigeria, to Kenya, to to all over the world was something really, really powerful, and it's still.
Oh yeah, it's still very powerful. I mean, before COVID, we did maybe 30 or 40 delegations around the world every year. So I've been to Syria and Jordan and Vietnam and a number of other places. So that's one of the projects I'm involved with. The other project is Freedom Archives, which is a historical archive, which I think will serve us well as we talk about the Black Link.
Black Link.
In terms of resources about radical movements, movements for change, movements of gender throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. I serve as a professor at the College of Marin. I head up a program entitled the Emoja program, which works to make sure that African students graduate and transfer. So we do a number of speaking events with people like Angela Davis and others. And then finally, I head up a weekly radio program, which covers Africa, which I've headed for 20 or 25 years. It's a collective of people, but we cover the news about the African continent, the African diaspora. So those are some of the things that I've been working on. But right now I'm taking a few days of vacation.
So we're making him work during the vacation. But we'll have to talk more about the Freedom Archives, because there's such a long tradition of resistance, of work that people have been doing forever. For hundreds of years, every time there's been oppression, people have resisted, people have won, people have done things. And it is important for people today who are resisting, people who are building solidarity or working together, to know what has happened before and how it happened before. So we'll talk more about that and how we can connect the work of the Freedom Archive with the new initiative with the Black Link.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that as we go forward. I think one of the important things about movements of resistance is that they have always documented the work that they're doing. Sometimes it's in written word, sometimes, for example, the Black Panther Party newspaper sold in the United States over 100,000 plus copies every week. Newspapers like Muhammad Speaks That's where people, in fact, both the Black Panther Party and Muhammad Speaks were where many African Americans became aware of the events and developments on the African continent, where we learned about Patrice Lumumba, where we learned about Amilcar Cabral. So what we're doing from all different types of movement is to collect that information, and at times to produce documentaries about developments in Puerto Rico. Right now we're doing something on the literacy program in Cuba, amazing program, which is, as soon as the Cuban Revolution occurred, Cuba sent all of its people into the rural areas to teach. So Cuba's literacy rate at this point is 99.9%. So it's that type of documentation that we're doing, and radical movements, Black movements, La Raza movements, LGBTQI movements, movements around land, movements around the environment. So we collect books, we produce films. It's just a beautiful amount of work.
Wow. Thank you, Walter. Next, we will talk about a friend, a great friend of yours, David Anderson. I met him once in New York, and I was fascinated by just his knowledge of the city. You know, I'm somebody who don't know New York, and walking with him, he could tell you every building, every road, not only what they are now, but what they used to be. And I don't think I've met anybody, you know, who knew things that way. So I was incredibly impressed, but also just his level of kindness, openness, and not taking himself serious. I mean, he's a star.
He is a star.
He's a star, but I didn't know. And I guess many people on the continent and even sometime in the US might not know. But I want you to tell us about, you know, David, who he is, some of the things, point us to some of the things that he's done, if people want to learn more, if people need to read or see things and know about him.
Yeah, that is a good point. One thing I will say is that David was very excited to meet you. I mean, he's that type of person, man. If you meet with David, if you meet him early in the morning, he'll be with you as long as you're with him. And he'll walk you through every street and every club and every business. So normally when most of us go to New York, we have a chance, we spend time with David Henderson. David Henderson and his wife, Barbara Christian. Barbara Christian is one of the leading thinkers around issues of gender and feminism in the 1960s and 1970s. She taught at the University of California, Berkeley. Written several kind of seminal pieces about gender and literature and a number of other things. David is from New York, and he is a founding member of Umbra Arts, what they call the Black Arts Movement, which I think is important for our conversation as we begin to talk about the role of culture and art and music in terms of linking people together. I know we often think politics, meaning we want to think, well, what's your political position? But in reality, culture drives the political position. And I think the more that we talk about the work that you're doing and others, we'll see how solid that connection has been over the years. So in the 1960s, when it began this period of kind of resistance around the war and John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Revolution, there were a number of people who were involved in writing. Some referred to them as beatniks or hippies, but in the Lower East Side, there were people such as Ishmael Reed, David Henderson, Leroy Jones, later to become Amiri Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, and all these other people who were involved in writing and literature. So David's one of the founding members of that, which was a cultural explosion, because it was like people were able to say what they've always wanted to say with a Black voice. So that was absolutely crucial. Leroy Jones, as many people know, Amiri Baraka, went on to be a poet laureate just about everywhere. David has written, he's known for this one poem which was called The Mayor of Harlem. And it's a brilliant poem about 125th Street and the Black Renaissance, etc. His most famous book is a book which is called Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky, which is a biography of Jimi Hendrix. And it has sold, it has sold, it has sold, it has sold. So David is this, he's a cosmopolitan, international person. He's a friend to everybody. So he's produced radio. In fact, if you look at people, and like some of them have been here to the Jazz Festival in San Luis, meaning people like David Murray, the world-class saxophone. David has written and produced poems with them. He's just a very, very kind soul. And he's really representative of that movement of Sonia Sanchez, a little bit earlier than people like Alice Walker, people like Ishmael Reed, people like Calvin Hurton, people like the playwrights, all of those people in that period of time. David really represents that voice. And his archives, I mean, he came out to the West Coast to move his archives. He's got storage lockers full of information. But he's a very, very dear friend to me, but even more important, he's a very, very dear friend to the African-American community and the arts community. And he totally enjoyed his time with you. After he met you once, but then he would say, when is Kumba coming back? I need to go to Senegal. When is Kumba coming back? So he's quite the person.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you so much for this. Our next conversation will be about Cuba. We went to Cuba together. It's been a dream of mine to go to Cuba. Of course, we all hear or learn, read about the Cuban Revolution. I'm trying to remember the year in Durban, South Africa, at the World Conference Against Racism.
Right.
Fidel Castro came.
Right.
And he had a long speech, really going through the history of Cuba in Africa, what the Cuban came to do to help, and how much the support was really directly to help African liberation. I'm so touched again, just when I went to Cuba and heard and seen people who have been, sent to Africa during those times, but also people even now, doctors, people are still coming to Africa, sent from Cuba. And just the commitment and saying that when they came to Angola, that the only thing they took back is the body of the people they lost. They didn't take any gold, any money, anything. So it's just so incredible that these stories are not so known, even to the people who are working in the social justice sector in the continent. And also, of course, even for African American, knowing about the history of Cuba and the connection with Africa is something that is really so important. And for years, you've taken delegations to Cuba through Global Exchange, and you are also, have family and in Cuba. I want you just to tell us a little bit, and of course these are just pointers because I need people to be able to figure out for themselves and to learn, to read, to question. Nobody has all the information. Just pointers about what should we know about Cuba as African, as Black people, as people who are working for justice. Where should we start also to know more, and what can we do?
Wow, you're asking me a big question.
Hey.
A very big question. And it was an honor to have you in Cuba. And I don't know if you remember that a few years before that you had said, because I've worked in Cuba for a number of years, over 25 or 30 years, you said, Walter, I want to go to Cuba. And so when you said that, I said, okay, well, let's see when the opportunity, so the opportunity came.
Yeah.
And you were able to come, and you were part of a conference that we were at, which was a conference in honor of Fidel Castro, the leader of the revolution, the 1959, who people often don't know that Fidel Castro, after the first effort to overthrow the Batista government, was in prison. He went back to Mexico and Central America, came back with Che Guevara, and on New Year's Eve, 1959, was able to overthrow the government. So the conference was in honor of Fidel Castro, Malcolm X, who most people know, El Haj Malik El Shabazz, and also of Lucius Walker, who was the founder of Pastors for Peace, who worked in solidarity with Cuba. A couple of pointers. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 is a major turning point because it really influences what begins to happen on the African continent. Already after Manchester and a number of other things, 17 African countries received independence in 1960. And they're very keen to make that connection instantly with Cuba. Cuba had support for Algeria, they had support for Guinea. They also, during the late 1960s events in the Congo, Che Guevara, and one of the people you had a chance to meet. Remember we went to the first session, the gentleman, he actually fought with Che Guevara in the Congo. So that's one of the turning points. It had tremendous influence on African Americans, on the movement for Pan-Africanism, for nationalism. The second piece that we were talking about, you were alluding to, has a lot to do with the way in which Cuba has been engaged with Africa since that day to the present. You see a lot of people from Africa, a lot of students who've gone to Cuba, to the Latin American School of Medicine for 6 years of free training to be a medical doctor. So during the period of COVID, during the period of medical needs in Mozambique and Angola, the Cubans constantly sent doctors, they sent technicians. In fact, were it not for Cuba, the chances that we would have a Nelson Mandela and a Zimbabwe would certainly be lessened. So it's been that specific role, I think, that's important for Cuba. Finally, and I think that's the reason why I wanted you to have a chance to see Cuba, to be able to share with the networks that you work with. The model that they worked on is not simply the notion of socialism, but it's of, as Fidel says, the new man and the new woman, developing this consciousness where you decide what the priorities are in your country. I have a Cuban daughter there, an adopted Cuban daughter, and a few years ago she came to me and said, Walter, I've been accepted into the university. I said, well, what do you know, how much does it cost? Can I get, well, it doesn't cost anything. You know, where am I going to study? We'll get together and we'll decide where I'm going to study. So this model of prioritizing the issues of what many are reluctant to call human rights, but are human rights, i.e. education, i.e. healthcare, i.e. housing, i.e. opportunities. Those are the landmarks. I think that all of us can learn from those examples. Not only people on the African continent, people throughout the world, but very specifically people in the United States. So Cuba is that kind of a beacon. It's kind of like a learning center. And I would caution people that the Cubans worked on this. Changing consciousness is not easy. The Cubans have worked on this for 50 or 60 years. And the people that you met who were just elated to meet you, people such as Kenya Serrano and others, they've been in the leadership of this. So there's a reason that there's pushback against Cuba, and once a person has a chance to think about it, and read about it, and learn about it, you'll see why. No, I was, of course, impressed just about the focus, like you say, on education. Just the high literacy rate that you talk about. I mean, and I'm looking at the African continent, of course, and I'm just like, there is a model. And this is not just done by the government. What I saw in Cuba and what I understood was that the government brought people into making the things happen. Like every single Cuban, you know, had to be involved and know what they have to do. I met these women who went in the rural area to do the literacy classes there,
to support people to make sure that everybody is literate. So if I had to think it back here, it would take everyone who's literate here to give back and make sure that everyone else who's not literate get literacy. So I was just amazed about that. And not only about the literacy, I thought of the health sector. And I was just like, wow, okay, it's possible to think of health in a different way, to train much more doctors, nurses, so that in a population you have numbers of doctors, of nurses that can take care of people. That is not just for business. Health is not a business, just. It's something that is, like you say, a human right. And same thing with the housing. I was just like, wow, how come everybody, I mean, you don't see a lot of people who has like huge palaces and all kind of, 10 or 20 houses that are locked that nobody uses.
Right.
And sometimes I think for people it might be hard, because for stars or people who consider themselves big,
True.
They just have the same houses that everybody else's have. They don't have a mansion. Right. So that might be a problem for certain people. But really, you don't see homeless people in the street as much as you see it, here in I would say even here in Dakar or in the US. So to me, I guess speaking about Cuba and giving pointers and is just for people to open their minds and look at possibilities and different possibilities to develop a place that is not the way we are basically not only taught but forced to think of development.
Yeah, you raise a point there about the way that the populace is engaged. I'm thinking now about the COVID crisis, because Cuba, of course, the United States has had an embargo against Cuba for 50, 60 years, based on the fact that the Cuban Revolution is in the Western Hemisphere, and based on this fear, this anxiety about the new model that Cuba presents. Meaning that, for example, when in 1975, in November 1975, when the South Africans had invaded Angola, the Angolans reached back to the Cubans for assistance, and the Cubans brought over 300,000 troops over a period of 10 to 12 years, who financed it themselves, went against their partners who didn't want to do it. And so it's a way of thinking. I had a very interesting conversation with a gentleman in Santa Spiritus, which is to the east of Havana, and there were a number of soldiers one evening, and I was asking the question somewhat in repartee. I said, well, why did you go fight in Angola? I said, because you're not African, you're Cuban. And they simply said to me, it's an act of international solidarity.
Yep.
And the Cubans called themselves, they recognize their African heritage. That's very, very much up front. So even during the COVID period, Cuba made COVID vaccines available. They developed 5 or 6 different vaccines on their own.
Yep.
That were shared around the world. But it's a consciousness, and as I always say, yes, there's a system that we refer to as socialism, but then there's a socialist consciousness. How you're thinking about your community, how you're thinking about how you want to live, how you want to emphasize issues of human rights, of education and healthcare. Are there challenges? Yes, there are challenges, but it creates a commitment towards that type of thinking. And that's the beauty about Cuba. And in fact, Cuba continues to take that model in a world in 2023, as you look around the world, which is in many cases completely contrary to that particular model. But it was so much fun to be there with Kumba, with my friend Kumba, and to have you, with your experience, to have a chance to engage with people on so many different levels. And we did a panel there. It was a little bit different because I was interviewing you, but there were people there who had fought in Angola. There were doctors, there were nurses, there were films, there were cultural centers, and it's an experience. I hope we can work out something that we can bring and continue to build that connection as we work on the Farafina, the Black Link?
Definitely. I want to bring artists from the African continent, feminists, children, teachers, doctors, politicians, just for people to experience it for themselves and learn and understand all the possibilities. I think would be just amazing. We have to figure out a way to build this connection with Cuba and Africa in a different level. Yeah. Not just government, but people to people, understanding, figuring out how we can do together. And this ownership of the Africanness in Cuba, to me, was also extremely touching, because we talk about reparations and so on, but what I heard from people there was like, yes, of course we will support African and Africans if they ask. Of course we're not going to go and do like, a religion and tell people what they're supposed to do or not. But if people ask for help, we will come because we believe that we owe it to them. I was like shocked. They were just like, yeah, African people were brought to Cuba, and worked in this country, into slavery. Cuba owe it to Africans to support them. I was just like, wow, I wish, some other countries could think that way.
It's a big leap. There's a favorite phrase that Che has. He says, as ridiculous as it may sound, the true revolutionary is motivated by great feelings of love. And you get that sense in Cuba.
Yeah.
Very much so. Let's work on making sure that we can get back. I mean, it was interesting because as soon as we were finishing that, Kumba was saying, "Oh, I'm coming back right away." Yeah, I'm coming back right away. I said, "Well, Kumba, you have to go home first." But it was a good conversation.
Yes, definitely. Our next conversation is on the Black Link. I'm really heading this initiative, of course, to continue connect and build solidarity among Black people. On the African continent, in the diaspora, of course, starting with the US, because that's been my first point of connection, particularly with people in the south of the US, in Selma, Alabama, with people who are the organizers of Jubilee, a connection with the, understanding, the civil rights movements, the voting rights movement, all of those things. So today, I'm really pushing forward, and our next connection will be with people in California, and it will be specifically with artists. We want to go and meet with people at Sankofa, headed by Gina Belafonte. We want artists to connect, and we want activists to connect. We want feminists to connect. We want young people to have the opportunity to move back and forth. We want people who are working against the, carceral systems in the US to connect with people here. So there's a lot that we want in terms of connection. But we build all this based on a history. There have been connections before. There have been solidarity before. There's been a whole movement, around an anti-apartheid movement. From people from the US. There have been so many movements and so many solidarity work. I'm wondering, what else should we think about? How should we think about these things to make sure that we have strong Black links going into the future? What can we do to make sure people who are interested in building a world of justice, who are Black, who are living on the continent, in the US, or anywhere else in the world, can connect better?
Wow, you're asking a big question. When you ask a historian a question like that, they always want to
go back.
They always want to go back, go back. I mean, and clearly, throughout the 19th century, I always tell this to my students, that when African people formed organizations, for example, like Bishop Richard Allen in 1787, who walks out of the Methodist Church, forms the African Methodist Episcopal Church. It's interesting to note, it may seem like a minor detail, but African Americans never named their church the First Negro Church. They didn't name it the First Black Church. They named it the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So it was clear that after 150, 200 years here in the United States, that African people who had come from Africa, who were enslaved in North America, thought of themselves and named themselves as African through the Pan-African movement of Henry Sylvester Williams, which tied together the Caribbean and Africa, etc., Manchester specifically, and then the events in the 1960s. And then you begin to see that by the SNCC movements, etc., that they really are a catalyst for making the link between African Americans and Africa. So you raised 2 points, I think, which are key here. One is about developing authentic movements, meaning that they represent the voices not simply of people at the grass tops, but they represent the voices of people at the grassroots. And then secondly, I think the point that you made is, and Malcolm makes this point at the end of his video, Make It Plain, that there need to be some very honest and very, very blunt and clear and transparent conversations between African Americans and between Africans. Because the African diaspora, although we say the African diaspora in the black world, we need to work on making that link between African people in Brazil and Cuba and Senegal and Mozambique and Chicago and New York and the UK, etc. So those pieces are just absolutely crucial, and with transparency. So when we were talking earlier, I said a big piece of that, I'm a historian by trade, a journalist, that's my profession to some degree, but this notion of the cultural connection of making sure that people can talk to each other. We were talking about David Henderson. We can talk about some of the people you know, that Alice Walker, making that connection through arts and culture and our spiritual links. Those are the places where I really think we can have an emphasis, but we have to be, as Lumumba would say, we have to be clear that the situation is grave, that this is a time to do this, and it's a time to do it now. So when I hear about the Black Farafina, I'm like, I'm very happy.
All right. Thank you, Walter. We'll have more conversation soon.
Okay.
But thank you for, who you are, what you do, and everything you give to this world. I'm so proud of just knowing you.
I'm proud of you.
Thank you.